Welcome, everybody. My name is John MacArthur. I'm the publisher of Harper's Magazine, and on the advisory board, or on the board of Reporters Without Borders U.S. chapter. And we're here today to discuss and amplify what seems to be an emergency in Iran, a press crackdown, or a crackdown on the press of not unprecedented proportions, but of considerable proportions in the run-up to the elections in June, I believe. I am alarmed by this, and Reporters Without Borders is alarmed by it. And in a world of press censorship emergencies, I would say this constitutes an emergency that's worth talking about. On a personal note, I'd like to tell you that my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, was Iranian, and I consider myself a friend of Iran. And because of my own criticism of American politicians and of the Bush administration, the last Bush administration in particular, I was a frequent guest on Iranian state radio and on the English service, because I don't speak Farsi. And I am appalled by this because I was permitted during the Bush administration to criticize my own government freely on the Iranian airwaves without censorship, and thus feel particularly concerned about the censorship of my comrades and colleagues in Iran, many of whom are not political and are just being rounded up like the usual suspects. Now, to tell us more about the situation, to introduce the subject, we have our Delphine Algon, who is the Washington, D.C. director of Reporters Without Borders, who has done the basic research, and then we're going to be hearing afterwards from somebody who suffered personally from Iranian censorship and imprisonment. But I'll just turn it over to Delphine to start.
Thank you, Ray. I would like to thank you, Scan News, and also Talk Radio News for organizing this event, and especially Tala, who made this event possible. And I'm really honored to represent Reporters Without Borders today, honored to represent the work we are doing since 1985 to defend journalists and media rights worldwide. So I'm thanking you on behalf of all our team, and especially on behalf of our 150 correspondents who are on the ground, and especially on behalf of the journalists and citizen journalists who are helping every day. So today, to talk about the situation in Iran, I chose to begin by telling you three stories. On October 30th, 2012, Sattar Beheshti was arrested at his home by the FTA, the Iran Cyber Police, for actions against national security on social networks and Facebook. He was taken into custody in Tehran. The security officer seized his computers. 6 days later, his mother received a message asking her to collect Sattar's body. Sattar is believed to have died under torture while he was being interrogated. An investigation was launched by the authorities. Sattar was a 35-year-old political activist and blogger. Second story. Another context. In February 2010, a young female journalist that we will call HK. So in February 2010, she was befriended with a colleague from a prestigious European newspaper at a government-organized conference in Tehran. A few days later, she was summoned to the intelligence ministry and questioned about her relationship with this foreign agent. She was accused of spying and of having sexual relationship with him. She was threatened unless she cooperated. She was forced to sign a statement that she had been raped by her foreign colleague. She is now in exile, and she is still subjected to pressure from her family. Reporters Without Borders reported around 20 similar cases. Last story. Really recently, on Sunday, January 27, 2013, Saba Azarpik was arrested at her home in Tehran. She is a freelancer for various reformist newspapers, and she recently wrote many articles about the death of Sattar Beheshti, the blogger who died in custody. This same day, this Black Sunday, 8 other journalists were arrested in Tehran. Unfortunately, I could choose to tell you many, many other stories, but I choose to tell you these 3 stories because I think they reflect a lot of reality of what is happening in Iran. First, it reminds us that right now, 41 journalists and 20 netizens are in jail in Iran. And other journalists have been sentenced to jail and can be jailed at any time. The sentences go from 6 months to 20 years. 15 journalists have been arrested in Tehran in the last 2 weeks. They are all now in isolated section, the section 209, which is of the heavy prison. And I would like to highlight the arbitrary and illegal aspects of this arrest. Most of the journalists were not covering politics, but they were business reporters or covering social issues. And now they hardly have access to their lawyers. In a statement, the Intelligence Ministry accused the journalists of belonging to a media network linked to the West, created by the BBC and managed in cooperation with several Western governments. I told you the story of this young female journalist, HK, because it's another illustration of this demonization of foreign media. The story of Sattar Beheshti, the blogger who died into custody, reminds us another sad reality. Up to now, no one responsible for the death in detention of any journalist or netizen have been brought to justice in Iran. We ask again and again that the Special UN Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, Ahmed Shahid, be allowed just to enter Iran to conduct an independent investigation for the death of Sattar, but for the death of other journalists who died before him. These 3 stories highlight also the common harassment faced by the families of the journalists who are jailed or targeted by the authorities. And last but not least, Saba's stories, who was arrested this Black Sunday, illustrate the new crackdown on the media personnel that we observe since end of January. And the Intelligence Ministry announced that more journalists could be arrested in the coming days. This new wave of arrest is sending a very clear signal to all journalists, and especially to those who don't repeat only the government propaganda. The authorities are making it clear that in advance of the June's election, they are preparing to suppress any attempt by the media to cover any protest that could have happened or the crackdown. We really observe that the authorities are stepping up the level of fear. They want to frighten everybody. In a sense, it's maybe because the authorities were surprised by the extent of the protest in the last, following the last presidential election in 2009. They are trying now to do everything they can to frighten journalists to avoid the same kind of crisis. Because what is important to understand is that the 2009 protests changed a lot of things. The regime knows that now he's more and more isolated. And it's also, I think, important to understand that the regime considers the next election as a crisis. And as for any crisis, the authorities are trying to suppress any attempt to cover it, to report, to talk about what is happening. So we should really consider this wave of arrests as an attempt to ensure the regime's stability and even survival. But we strongly believe that this intimidation attempt is doomed to fail. Because actually, the crisis now in Iran is general. It's too important to be hidden. We observe right now a political crisis in Iran, a social and an economic one. When I'm talking about political crisis, I'm thinking of an open war between the different government factions. Just to give you some example, recently the parliament speaker was not able to give a speech in Qom because he was molested by Ahmadinejad defender. And a few days later, Ahmadinejad himself accused the parliament speaker to be a thief in front of the parliament, just to give you an idea of the political atmosphere right now. And when I was talking about economic crisis, right now it's hard to hide the poverty, which is atrociously visible. It's hard to hide the consequences of the sanctions, but the media have no right to talk about it. So 34 years after the revolution, the regime doesn't want to read in the newspaper what is really happening in their country, but it doesn't change the fact that what is happening is that the model is failing and is facing a serious crisis. The authorities are blaming foreign forces when they accuse the journalists of collusion with foreign media, but the blame won't change the reality, won't change the fact that there is a serious crisis. I want just to end by talking about the internet and how the way the regime is trying to control internet is actually another illustration of this crisis. So, as you know, since many years, the regime is filtering and monitoring internet. And what we say is that they limit so much the speed of the connection, that is because it's more difficult to download videos, that actually if you want to know if something is happening in Iran, you just have to check what is the speed of the connection today. And so as I said, YouTube is blocked, and actually the Iranians who don't know or who don't dare to use circumvention tools, they don't have access to a free internet. They have access to a very limited internet. And very recently, but even if they were talking about it since many years, the authorities officially launched what they call a national email service and a national internet network called the Clean Internet or Halal Internet, which is supposed to be used already by the government and civil services. But according to our own investigation, nobody is using it. And actually, the people we contacted who are working in this civil service, they are using VPN to access internet. So VPN, for the non-geek among us, it's a virtual private network, which is the most common way for Iranians to access a free internet. They can buy this VPN in a kind of black market, but which is kind of legal too, because that's all the paradox in Iran between what is forbidden and how the business is running. Because VPN are forbidden, but if they could enter Iran and be sold, it's because the Revolutionary Guards are selling them. Same for the satellite dishes. So in a way, the censorship is another way for the regime to try to continue business and to earn money. So I hope that I give you a first idea of the crisis and all the paradox that we can observe right now in Iran. And I will just finish with what we call in French a note d'humour to illustrate, I think, all these paradox. So as I said, and as you know, Facebook is blocked in Iran, but Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has an account. So people are asking him on his wall, so what VPN are you using? So I hope it gives you idea for questions, and I look forward to hearing the comments of Roxana and your question.
I'll just quickly introduce Roxana Saberi, who is an author, a journalist, and a human rights advocate, and who was notably incarcerated by the Iranians on trumped-up charges when she was working as a journalist in Iran in 2009. Her first book was called Between Two Worlds, My Life in Captivity in Iran, and she's working on a second book about Iran, but I presume you haven't been back since you were jailed. Altogether, you spent 8 months? I'm sorry.
It was
I'm sorry.
100 days in prison.
Well, I'm sorry, 100 days in prison. And we're happy to have Roxana because she can talk about what it's like for these reporters to be in jail. I've got some specific questions I want to ask her, but why don't you introduce the topic?
Okay, thank you. I don't have any specific remarks prepared. I just want to say when I was in Iran last, it was 2009. I left just before the presidential election of June 2009. And since then, the atmosphere for the press and the news media in Iran has become much more restricted. Many journalists have been intimidated, interrogated, jailed, as you've heard. Many have been forced to flee the country. I believe Reporters Without Borders has documented the cases of more than 200 journalists who have had to flee Iran since 2009 because of their work or because of fear of persecution or because they were in prison and they didn't want to be imprisoned again. Many publications have been shut down, and many journalists have just left their profession because they're too afraid. I believe that freedom of the press is a fundamental human right for people to use the media and share information with the public without prior restraints like fear of punishment for what they say or what they write. And this freedom of the press has been under greater and greater attack in Iran. I also want to say that it's very important, and I'm glad to see the media here today covering this topic. It's very important for the international community to be aware of what's been happening inside Iran on these attacks on the freedom of the press in Iran. When people are jailed in Iran, it's very important for them to know that people on the outside care. I saw when I was in prison, and other people have been through prison in Iran, prisoners of conscience, political prisoners. They felt empowered when they found out that people on the outside had not forgotten them and were speaking out for their freedom and for their rights. It's one of the worst feelings to feel that you've been forgotten and you're in a prison cell and maybe nobody cares about your plights. So I hope that journalists out there can cover this issue, raise questions about these imprisonments of journalists in Iran, and also that governments that have close ties with Iran, political or economic ties with Iran, can use their relations with the Iranian regime to call for these journalists' release. And also ordinary people can make a big difference by speaking out, whether spreading the word on Facebook and Twitter, social media, signing petitions, and so on. These voices, when they come together over a continuous period of time, they can make a difference. They might not lead to the release of every prisoner of conscience in Iran, and there are thought to be more than 500 of them, including journalists, bloggers, student activists, attorneys, women's rights activists, and so on. It might not lead to everybody's release, but at the very least, it sends a message to the Iranian authorities that they cannot continue to act and infringe basic human rights with impunity. And also it sends a message to the Iranian people, those who are in prison, if they can hear this message, and also to their friends and families and others in Iran that they are not forgotten.
Thank you.
Well, we want to get questions from everybody here, but I just want to start out by asking whether they picked on you, possibly because you have an Iranian parent. And do you speak Persian?
Yes, with an accent.
With an accent, but did that have anything to do with your?
It's hard to say. Because I'm half Iranian. My father's Iranian. I was in Iran on an Iranian passport. My captor said that they didn't recognize dual nationality and they would treat me just as an Iranian. And so that my arrest was an internal matter and not a matter for other governments to become involved in. But I don't know if it had an effect in my arrest or not. I did find out later that it was very important for other governments to speak out for me, though. My mother's Japanese, and the Japanese government also pressured the Iranian government. The American government did. The Swiss embassy representing American government in Iran also helped. So that's why I also think in other people's cases, prisoners of conscience and political prisoners who are wrongfully held in Iran, that they also need these voices speaking out for them.
Okay, and could you just talk for a minute about what it was like to be in solitary confinement the first day, so that people get a sense of what it's like for these guys who are being
Sure.
imprisoned now?
It's terrifying. It's terrifying not knowing what's going to happen to you. It's terrifying being cut off from the world. Many people, when they're arrested, they're not allowed to tell their families or their loved ones where they are. They don't have access to an attorney, usually until their interrogations are complete, and often the interrogations are not complete until they cooperate with their captors, which sometimes means they're forced to give a so-called confession, implicating themselves or people they know in, for example, crimes against national security. And these are often false confessions, which the Iranian authorities who force them to give these confessions say they are true confessions. Solitary confinement, I was in solitary for 2 weeks. Some prisoners in Iran are in solitary for much, much longer. And that's a very difficult period of time because I think we as human beings need contact with other human beings. And it would get so bad for me and some other prisoners that sometimes we thought I would even rather speak to my interrogator than sit in this cell alone, because every second feels like a minute, every minute feels like an hour, and every hour feels like a day. And at the same time, you're not given, this is usually the case, you're not given any books in solitary except the Quran, or paper, pen, or TV, obviously. And you just long for human contact. And at the same time, you're often undergoing intense interrogations that are very difficult. Sometimes physical torture does happen in Iran's prisons. I was not physically tortured, but there are many very reliable accounts of people who have been physically tortured. There's also something called white torture, which doesn't leave a mark on your body, but it can devastate your mind and your conscience. It's psychological torture. And the interrogators and the captors are very skilled at this kind of white torture. They don't want there to be proof or evidence of the pressures that they put on some of these prisoners to make false confessions or to implicate their friends or their colleagues or to cooperate in other ways with their captors.
Okay. Like to get questions in back there?
Thank you. There has been... Hold on. Hands Off Cain in Italy always publishes every night a list of prisoners that are being, the death penalty is applied to them around the world, and it seems that there's so much happening in Iran that the death penalty is being meted out very, very frequently, like on a weekly basis. How true is it that these are all drug traffickers? And how can you prove that the death penalty is only being handed out to people doing huge crimes in Iran?
So, in 2012, for the first time, 3 bloggers were sentenced to death penalty in Iran. But we were very concerned about this new step. But it seemed that they were kind of, that the sentence is not going to happen right now. But as our work focuses on journalists and citizen journalists, I cannot really talk about political activists who are facing death penalty in Iran, but it's a big concern, yeah.
I could just add that Iran is said to have the highest per capita rate of executions in the world. And it's difficult to say what the details of these different cases are because oftentimes they're just not transparent.
Other questions? Here we go.
Yes, to the floor. There's been, when this started, it was at the end of this month, right? This wave of...
End of January.
End of January. Oh, sorry, last month.
Yeah.
It happened at the same time where Iran and the United States seems they starting a conversation or talk about another problem, the nuclear problem. Because here, at least here, in this building, I didn't hear anybody. I've been asking for about the last 3 weeks. I've been asking myself, some of my colleagues too, what the Secretary General, what any country thinks about this wave of arrest. No one has issued anything official, nothing, no one line. So my question is it possible that because something bigger than, for example, the respect of an international, human right, like an Article 19 or Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in this moment is put it aside by the United Nations. Actually, the United Nations, after about 1 week ago, issued something. But is it possible that there is some interest here for continue this conversation about the nuclear issue? And the journalist in this moment actually can be a problem. I ask you if you think the same, if you start to suspect the same thing that I'm been suspecting in the last days. Thank you.
I'm glad you're raising this issue, and I hope you will continue to do it, and that it will encourage the authorities to raise their voice about what is happening. I don't have any analysis or conviction of complot. Plot. But I'm glad that we are raising this issue, because the point is that people and authorities have to raise their voice about what is happening.
I'll answer that. It's absolutely. I mean, it's realpolitik, and it's unfortunately the state of journalism in this country, certainly, where the official announcement trumps the independent initiative of reporters interested in other things. And right now, as you say, the story, the lead, is about a thaw, or at least an increase in the level of tolerance for Iran. Thus, the intolerant side of Iran, the ugly side of Iran internally, gets pushed to the side. People are less interested. This happens all the time. But that's because, as you say, the agenda of foreign offices all over the world is right now concentrated on encouraging a conversation between the United States and Iran on their nuclear program. But it doesn't make the emergency any less urgent for the reporters who are getting tossed in jail. And you could also suspect that the Iranians are taking advantage of the situation. There's less attention focused on domestic repression, so it's easier to round people up with less protest.
I'll add something. There was a group of, I don't know if you saw this release, news release by a group of independent UN human rights experts. They did comment on the, you did see that. They did comment on the arrest, so I was glad to see that. But yes, oftentimes human rights issues do get pushed out of the spotlight when political issues come up. And I think it's very important that human rights is not a second or third tier issue. It's always a first tier issue. And Iranians, I believe many Iranians also feel that way. One of my cellmates told me before I left prison, she said, when you leave here and go back to America, please tell others our country's not only about the nuclear issue, it's also about people like us.
Very quickly, I was very involved in the defense of Salman Rushdie 23 years ago, and I remember telling him when I went to see him in London that he had to come out and become more public in his anti-censorship, make his message more universal, because as good as the British government was in protecting him, they had realpolitik reasons for not putting him at the top of their agenda with Iran. They had about 10 other things, presumably, that they were more interested in pushing with Iran than lifting the fatwa. So, sorry, go ahead.
I came a little bit late, so you may have actually addressed this earlier. Do you know if it is risky for a normal Iranian to be in email contact with an American? I had telephoned a friend in Iran a couple of years ago, and she said not to email her till she got to France. She has a daughter in France. So this is just a detail, but how much do you know about the difficulty in an Iranian citizen? She happens to be a professor at a university, contacting by email someone from the United States, for example. Also, I believe, now I got confused. You said Ahmadinejad had, was it email or Facebook? I wasn't sure.
The supreme leader.
Oh,
It was,
Khamenei.
Khamenei.
oh. I don't, yeah. But as far as the regular email, or even a direct telephone call, do you know whether that would put an Iranian citizen in jeopardy?
I guess we can both answer, but so it's good to be aware of the risk it can involve when you're exchanging emails with Iranians in Iran. So I would say that I hope and I believe that most of the activists, they know how to protect themselves, how to protect their emails, how to protect their networks. But any error can have immense consequences. I can just tell you that most of the people have like different Gmail accounts. So they have one that they use for their family, one they use for professional. So I think the best is to follow what they tell you to do, because according to their level of knowledge of the circumvention tools, and to be careful in everything you write and everything you can say on the phone, and also on Skype. Skype is not a safe way to communicate.
Sorry, I do have my hair. Is it on? Anyway, yes, now it's on. I see you don't have your blue scarf on, Roxanne.
It's in the laundry today.
Yes, right. Has there been any reaction from the UN in Geneva, where they do allegedly deal with human rights, but anyway, have a Human Rights Commission, High Commissioner for Human Rights? Have there been contact of Reporters Without Border and other groups with Navi Pillai's office?
As far as I know, we are waiting for official reaction or actions.
But one of the people in the group of special UN reporters who had commented on this, on the recent arrests, was the special UN expert for human rights in Iran. I don't know the exact title that he has Ahmad Shahid. And he was also in that group of people who did who spoke out about these arrests, and he was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council first in 2011, and I think it was his position was renewed in 2012. But he was the one, I believe you mentioned, he has not been able to visit Iran yet. The Iranian regime has not allowed him in yet.
Yes. Ms. Saberi, I'd just like to ask you, you mentioned you were in Iran prior to the presidential elections in 2009, at the period of the Green Revolution, as it's known. What role do you think the United States government could, or should I say should, have taken at that point to help a democratic resistance movement inside Iran?
Should I stay away from that kind of
I don't. I think the role we can all play is by letting their own people decide of their own future. But what we can do here as a journalist is reporting on what is happening. Just saying what is happening, just being the voice of the people of Iran, just being the voice of the journalists of Iran who are not allowed to talk about what is happening, I think is a first very important step of what we can do, us as individuals, us as journalists, and then talking about how the US can help the Iranian people. I'll let maybe Rick answer that, but I think it's a very tricky one.
You're asking what can you do practically? What the United States? Yeah, realpolitik aside. I mean, see, I'm divided on this issue because I think human rights doctrine has been so misused and abused by the Bush administration that it's as a foreign policy tool that it's been damaged. It's not as useful as it used to be. So the minute you start denouncing a regime based on human rights violations, people hit back with they quote Bush or they quote Wolfowitz, and it's up to us in the human rights community, I guess you could say, to work harder at reestablishing fidelity and adherence and confidence in Article 19. You don't hear Article 19 talked about anymore. It sort of disappeared from the debate. I don't know that Hillary Clinton ever invoked Article 19. Maybe she did. Did she?
She does, and
she
actually
does? Okay.
freedom
Okay.
of expression and freedom of internet are priorities for the State Department.
So,
It's good to know.
all right. Well, then I withdraw that criticism of Clinton. But she was also very hypocritical during the Iraq crisis, and so the more the United States government can lean on the UN and on UN doctrine, the better, and less on national interest. I think that this is the place where the United Nations ought to be the central player, and the United Nations ought to be protesting formally the imprisonment of this wave of imprisonments. It's an outrage. But that's where the United States should be pressuring the UN. Yes, sorry. Oh, sorry, were you ahead of us there, back? Yeah, back here.
It's on. Hi, this is a question particularly for Ms. Saveri. Based on your experiences in Iran in 2009, what are your expectations for the coming elections in June? Do you think that citizens and journalists in Iran have the stamina to fight the authorities again during this election, or do you expect it to be a quieter turnout? Thank you.
A quieter turnout at the polls, you mean?
Yes, at
In the streets too, you mean? Well, I think there's more of an atmosphere of fear now than there was at the election time in 2009, because this atmosphere was created basically the day of the elections and in the aftermath of the elections. And when people went out to protest the results, they were beaten, they were arrested, some were killed. Many people fled the country. I think Iran is a country that's very difficult to predict. I like to say the only thing predictable about Iran is that it's unpredictable. So I can never say exactly what's going to happen, but I do believe that the feeling of fear is much stronger than before. But also, there's a saying in Farsi, it's "Atash zir khak," and it means like fire under the earth. Am I saying that correctly? Okay. And I feel like there are a lot of people's anger and resentment is simmering under the surface, and perhaps they're waiting for a way to express these emotions. But right now, many people are afraid. When you see your family members get arrested, or if you work for the government and your livelihood relies on getting paid by the government or the regime, you don't want to risk that. Or if you're the breadwinner in your family and you're arrested, how are you going to support your kids? I also think many Iranians are looking at what's happening in Syria, and the Iranians who would like some kind of change in Iran, many of them are discouraged because they feel there has not been much of an international response to all the deaths that have taken place in Syria. So it's hard to predict exactly what will happen, but I do believe there's a much stronger feeling of fear this year than there was at this time in 2009. It was relatively, there was more of an open atmosphere. The press were freer at this time in 2009. The crackdown happened like as soon as the elections happened.
Yes, this is for Reporters Without Borders. Okay, thank you. This is for Reporters Without Borders. One of your missions is to improve the safety of journalists, especially those reporting in a war zone. Can you give us examples of where your efforts have worked or did not work?
Okay. So our work is first to report and investigate on press freedom violation around the world, and we are able to do that thanks to our network of 150 correspondents. That's our main work. But as you say, we also help and assist journalists in emergency situation, and we also help and assist journalists who are going to war zones. There's many things we are doing to try to do that work as much as we can. First, we rent helmet and bulletproof jackets for actually very cheap. Actually, we kind of give them against a caution. And we also provide insurance for freelancers who are going to war zone at a very cheap rate. We also publish guide for journalists going to war zone, which are translated in Urdu, in Farsi, in Arabic, and it's half like medical assistance, or we have also a hotline that journalists can call at any moment, anywhere in the world, to alert us of what is happening. So that are, I guess, few examples of what we are trying to do to help the journalists who are going in conflict area. We are also, if they come to us, we will help them to get contacts on the ground, or to have advice on how to protect their emails if they're going to regimes who are monitoring the internet, but also to protect their their rush after they interviewed sensitive sources. And we actually can help them to encrypt the data of their work in sensitive areas to come back to Europe or to the US with this very important information. So that's kind of some examples of what we are trying to do.
Yeah.
Hi, this is from ScanNews. My question is to anybody who can answer. How can you distinguish between real journalists and spy? And how can you help the governments to kind of distinguish between these two? Because it's very easy. In Cold War, we saw a lot of Russian who came to US, Israelis goes to Middle East, Chinese comes around the world. So how can you really distinguish? And how can you say, okay, this is a journalist, this is not, and help the journalists who are in prison and kind of I don't know, how can you do that? Thanks.
Well, as you know, there were a lot of American journalists who were really CIA stringers during the Cold War. And just because you're a CIA stringer doesn't mean that you've lost your rights under Article 19 or under the First Amendment. As much as I find that objectionable and disgusting that somebody would have a double identity or double job, a lot of these people were legitimate journalists doing stringer work. Now, I don't know anything about or had informal relationships with American intelligence services. Now, I wouldn't presume to know anything about the status or the actual, the independence, let's say, of every single Iranian journalist who's imprisoned. But if they're accredited journalists working for a newspaper or a magazine, they deserve the protection of the law, international law at least, and they deserve the attention of the international community that cares about these things. If we'd known in 1967 that C.L. Sulzberger had connections with the CIA, I'm not sure we would have justified his being clapped in jail in Moscow. We would have protested it. I don't know. Do you,
Yeah,
do you have any thoughts about that?
I would maybe just give how we at RSF. It's a very important issue for us to justify the honesty of our work, to be sure that the journalists we're defending are real journalists and are providing information. So I can tell you that it's a lot of work for us to make sure that the journalists are in prison because of their journalist activities. But as you say, everybody has the right to express itself, and that's it.
I can just speak about what I witnessed and experienced in Iran and what I've heard about Iran. I think that oftentimes the captors who arrest journalists or others, well, I'll focus on journalists, and claim that they're spies, this is just, it's such a common accusation in Iran. And I think one of the main reasons is they want to silence the journalists, they want to create fear among journalists, and this is just an easy accusation to throw upon journalists. And, you know, how do they define espionage? Sometimes they say it's just when you interview people and you share information with the public that they don't want you to share, or you provide analysis. This is one of the accusations against me. I provided analysis in one of my reports. And it wasn't even my analysis. I interviewed analysts who gave the analysis that I just shared. And they said, well, you shouldn't have provided that analysis. So sometimes they see espionage in different ways. But also, sometimes they know that somebody's not a spy, and they insist that the person is a spy because they want to silence this person. In my case, I was forced to give a false confession saying I was a spy, that I was writing a book that was a cover for espionage for the United States. This was the whole storyline that they wanted me to say. They made up for me. I took back the confession. I recanted it. Then I was sentenced to 8 years in prison. They used my forced confession as evidence against me. But in private, they told me, they admitted to me, my lead interrogator did, that he knew I wasn't a spy, but yet I was sentenced to 8 years in prison. So I think oftentimes they know who is or isn't a spy, and they use espionage as an accusation when they know these many, as far as I know, the journalists I know are innocent and not spies. They use this accusation to silence them. But I think in this latest round of attacks, one of the accusations was that journalists are trying to incite a soft war against the regime. I don't know if they've been using espionage, accusation of espionage in this round.
For the moment, the journalists who were arrested most recently, they are not charged officially, but the ministry released a statement saying that the journalists are accused of belonging to a media network linked to the West, created by the BBC and managed in cooperation with several Western governments. That's how we translated the statement. So there's not the word spy, but it's kind of the close idea.
But again, I just emphasize that if you're working as a reporter in a country like Iran, and somebody from a European or the American embassy contacts you for lunch to talk about what you know, there's no rule against having lunch with that person because they might be a spy. They might be an espionage agent. In fact, a good journalist would try to get information about out of the government official, try to exchange information. So there are situations where the government might suspect something because you've met with somebody they're watching from a foreign embassy, but that doesn't make you an espionage, an agent of influence or an agent of espionage. And so I think you can cut it too fine, and you really have to be without knowing everything about everybody's work, journalistic work, every detail of it. You have to make the protection universal. And of course, occasionally there might be an espionage agent thrown in with the legitimate journalists.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I agree that I think what's most important is that whoever is accused of a crime is supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. It's supposed to be free of torture, whether it's mental or physical, and should have access to an attorney. And the attorneys in Iran are oftentimes under a lot of pressure. I mean, there are attorneys in jail. Attorneys have been forced to flee the country. So these are all shortcomings in the legal process for journalists and others who are arrested in Iran.
Sure. Thanks a lot. This is really interesting. I noticed that you said that the UN or international law should be at the forefront of raising these issues. So I wanted, since RSF is here, and in light of that statement, I wanted to know sort of how you guys view the UN in terms of performing its work under Article 19, both the Secretary General and being vocal enough on, not only on Iran, but issues of like in Sri Lanka, many journalists have been disappeared. Often nothing is said. Sometimes Navi Pillay speaks. Often the Secretary General doesn't. And even the UN itself, in terms of, it's not anywhere near as graphic as what of the issues that you said, but in terms of accrediting journalists, I'll just give you an example. They say that, okay, but the question is, how do you judge the UN since it doesn't accredit all journalists they disaccredit journalists based on where they come from on Earth, and there are no due process rules for journalists if they seek to throw them out, as I think RSF is aware. There's an issue that was raised to you last year.
Yes. So we are in contact and regular contact with many UN representatives, and we work closely with them because we believe the UN can play a very important role for the defense of journalists in many countries, but also in the context of conflict when journalists are killed, and we would like to see the UN to do more things. As I said, we are asking again and again for the access to Iran of the special rapporteur. Ahmed Shahid, to allow him to investigate independently the crimes committed against journalists. And I can tell you also that we worked closely for the adoption of the resolution 1738, I think, in 2006, which make a crime to target journalists in conflict zone. And we hope that this resolution can go far beyond, and that the UN will maybe have a group of experts who can investigate the crimes committed against journalists, and we will continue this work in this direction.
Certainly the UN could do better than they're doing, but it depends on the member states. How well they do. If the United States is not pushing hard enough, France is not pushing hard enough, Britain's not pushing hard enough on these issues, it obviously is going to be a lower priority. And again, I go back to the American hypocrisy on the use of human rights in both Bush administrations, the elder and the younger, and the misuse of the UN in both those crises. We've got a lot of work to do. Re-education about Article 19 and about universal principles of freedom of information. We need to talk more about Eleanor Roosevelt. People have to get to know her better.
So if you would like to ask questions, you're free to ask the panelists individually, but we have to kind of leave the room soon.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.